My name is Margaret Lane. I'm 74 years old, and I have been a member of Grace Revival Church for over 40 years. I've buried friends there, watched my children grow up in the youth choir, and poured almost every spare dollar into its offerings. The church was my home. The pastor, at least the man I thought was my pastor, was someone I trusted more than anyone else. But that trust was shattered in a single moment that I will never forget. It happened on a Thursday evening after prayer meeting. I had stayed behind because Pastor Raymond said he felt led by the Spirit to pray for me privately. I didn't think much of it at first. I was struggling with my blood pressure and some recent grief after losing my younger sister. He led me into his office, closed the door softly, and told me to kneel so he could lay hands on me. His voice was low, soothing, the way it always was when he prayed, and I closed my eyes, expecting to hear words of comfort. But then, his hands didn't stay where they should have. At first, I thought maybe he'd accidentally brushed against me. I told myself I must be imagining it. Who would think such a thing about their own pastor? But then his palm slid lower, slow and deliberate, pressing into me in a way that made my entire body go cold. My eyes flew open. He was still murmuring prayers, eyes half closed, as if nothing was wrong. My mouth went dry, my heartbeat thundered in my ears, and my knees felt weak. Not from the prayer, but from the realization that I was in the room alone with him, and no one would hear me if I screamed. Froze. My mind raced with every Sunday sermon he'd preached about purity, about resisting temptation, about honoring the women of the church. And here he was, violating me in the name of God. I wanted to shove him away, to shout, to demand answers, but before I could move, he leaned in closer, his breath warm near my ear, and whispered, "Don't be afraid, Sister Margaret. God is using me to heal you." Right then, something inside me snapped. But what I did next changed everything, and not just for me. Before I tell you what happened in that moment, you need to understand how I ever ended up alone in that office with a man I thought I could trust with my life. Because my story didn't begin there. It began years earlier, when I still believed that faith alone could protect me. Back then, I was a widow in my late 50s, just trying to keep my family together after my husband's sudden passing. The church became my refuge. Pastor Raymond had been new to the congregation, younger than most of us expected. Charismatic, full of energy, with a way of making everyone feel seen. He'd stop by my home to pray for me, sometimes bringing groceries from the church fund, though I later learned those groceries came out of his own pocket. Or so he said. I let my guard down because of those little gestures. Looking back now, I can see the pattern. He always gave just enough kindness to make you feel indebted, then made you trust him with parts of your life you didn't share with anyone else. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. Other women in the congregation seemed to hold him in the same glowing light. And that was the problem. When someone shines that bright, nobody stops to look for shadows. I remember the first time I felt uneasy around him. It was during a women's retreat, when we all stayed in a lodge outside town. One evening, I was walking back to my cabin after dinner when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, smiling, holding a flashlight. He said he was just making sure the ladies got to their rooms safe. But he lingered, asking me questions that felt personal. Too personal. I brushed it off. After all, wasn't he just being a good shepherd to his flock? From that night onward, small things began to add up. His hand on my back would stay a second too long when we greeted at the church door. He'd make comments about my appearance. Not crude but pointed. "You've still got that glow, Sister Margaret," he'd say, with a smirk that didn't belong in a house of God. And each time I'd laugh nervously and change the subject, because the alternative meant acknowledging that something was wrong. But nothing prepared me for what happened the night of the private prayer. The church was nearly empty when he called me over, saying, "I've been feeling the Spirit pressing me to lift you up tonight." His tone made it sound like a blessing, but his eyes, there was something in them I couldn't place. He led me into his office, told me to kneel, and began his prayer. And for a few moments, it felt like any other prayer session, until his hands moved. The shock paralyzed me, but the shame hit harder. Because when something like that happens in church, in a place you've always felt safe, your brain can't process it right away. I thought of the women who sat beside me every Sunday, singing hymns with their eyes closed. Would they believe me if I told them? Would anyone? And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting my own fear. I was fighting the weight of his position, his influence, his spotless reputation. What I chose to do next would put me in danger. But it would also set off a chain of events that exposed far more than I ever imagined. Because Pastor Raymond wasn't the man we all thought he was. And I was about to prove it. If you think you know how this ends, you don't. Stay with me. This is only the beginning. If this story already has your heart racing and your blood boiling, I want you to hear every word until the very end. You need to know how deep this went, and how far I had to go to protect myself and others. Please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what's coming next will shake you to your core. I wish I could tell you that I stood up in that moment, looked Pastor Raymond in the eye, and told him exactly what kind of man he was. I wish I could say I stormed out, slammed the door and called the police. But that's not what happened. The truth is, when you're a 74-year-old woman, alone in a locked office with a man everyone worships as a spiritual leader, fear has a way of wrapping around your throat like a rope. I stayed kneeling. My hands trembled, and my voice caught in my chest. I tried to pull away just enough to signal that I was uncomfortable, but he pressed down harder, still murmuring prayers as though nothing was happening. That was when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. He knew exactly what he was doing. I forced myself to focus on one thought. Get out. I said I wasn't feeling well and needed some water. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, then slowly lifted his hands and stepped back. I stood as quickly as my stiff knees would allow, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you for the prayer, Pastor," I whispered, my voice shaky. I opened the office door, half expecting him to stop me. But he didn't. He just stood there watching me walk out. And in that look, I saw something that chilled me more than his touch. A confidence, as if he was certain I'd keep my mouth shut. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my head, questioning myself. Did I overreact? Did I misinterpret? But every time I tried to excuse it, I remembered the deliberate way his hands moved, the way his voice dipped lower when he whispered in my ear. "Well." I knew what had happened. The next morning I went about my routine as if nothing was wrong. Grocery shopping, feeding the chickens, folding laundry. But inside my mind was a storm. Part of me wanted to confront him in front of the whole congregation. Another part feared that if I spoke, the church would turn on me. People don't like to believe their shepherd could be a wolf. By Sunday I thought I'd decided to keep quiet. I told myself I'd just avoid being alone with him. But then something happened that shattered that plan. During the service, Pastor Raymond preached about the power of confession, and how hiding sin gives Satan a foothold in your life. His eyes swept over the congregation, and for a split second, I swear they locked on me. My skin prickled. Was that a warning? Or was it guilt? After the service, as I was leaving, I overheard two younger women in the restroom whispering. "I hate it when he prays over me," one said. "He always puts his hands way too low." The other laughed nervously. "Yeah, but that's just his style. My aunt says he's like that with everyone." Froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. It's not just me. Right then, the fear I'd been carrying shifted into something else, anger. If he was doing this to other women, maybe even younger women, then my silence wasn't protecting me. It was protecting him. And I couldn't live with that. I decided I would watch, listen, and gather proof. Not just for me but for anyone else he might have hurt. But I knew I couldn't go to the deacons without something concrete. Pastor Raymond had charm, influence, and years of trust on his side. All I had was my word, and I'd seen enough to know that wouldn't be enough. So I started paying attention. I noticed how he lingered when shaking hands with certain women. How he counseled them behind closed doors. How they came out looking pale and shaken, but smiled tightly if anyone asked questions. I started keeping a notebook in my purse, writing down dates, times, and names. One night after Bible study, I saw him lead a young mother, Lisa, barely in her 30s, into his office. They were in there for 20 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red. She didn't stay to talk to anyone. I wanted to grab her arm to ask her outright what had happened, but I knew I had to be careful. If I scared her, she might shut down. So instead, I watched her walk to her car, shoulders hunched, and I wrote it down. The more I observed, the more I realized how calculated he was. He never touched the more outspoken women. Only the ones he thought wouldn't speak up. The widows. The single mothers. The shy newcomers. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd stayed late to arrange flowers for Sunday's service. The hallway was dim, most of the lights off. I was walking past the pastor's office when I heard muffled sobs. Froze. The door was slightly ajar. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. What I saw made my stomach turn, and confirmed that I was dealing with a predator. And this time I wasn't going to walk away. Because I knew exactly what I needed to do to bring him down. If you're hearing this and you believe people like Pastor Raymond can't exist in a church, I'm telling you, they can. And they do. Don't miss the next chapter because what I did next could have cost me everything. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. This is just getting started. I gripped the wall outside Pastor Raymond's office, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Through the narrow gap of the door, I saw Lisa sitting in a chair, her face turned away from me. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders trembling. Pastor Raymond stood over her, one hand on her shoulder, the other, slowly moving lower. I wanted to burst in right then, but instinct told me not to. Not yet. If I confronted him without proof, he'd deny it, turn it around on me, and I'd be the one branded as bitter or delusional. So I did the only thing I could think of. I quietly pulled my phone from my purse and hit record. My fingers shook so badly I almost dropped it. I leaned closer, praying the microphone would catch enough. His voice was low but clear. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Lisa. Let go of your fear, and let the Spirit move through you. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. I don't feel right about this, Pastor. That was all I needed to hear to know I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't just my trauma, this was his pattern. I pulled back before either of them saw me, my legs carrying me down the hall faster than my knees liked. I hid in the kitchen until I heard the sound of the office door open and footsteps heading out. I didn't see Lisa again that night. When I got home, I replayed the audio. It wasn't perfect. The hallway echo made it hard to catch every word, but you could hear enough to understand what was happening. Still, it wasn't ironclad. The church board could still spin it as pastoral counseling. I knew I needed more. For the next few weeks, I made it my mission to be in that building whenever possible. If Pastor Raymond stayed late, I stayed late. If he arrived early, I found a reason to be there, arranging hymnals or dusting pews. And always I kept my phone ready. It was exhausting. I was 74, my joints ached, my eyesight wasn't what it used to be. But every time I thought about stopping, I remembered the way Lisa's voice had sounded. Small, hesitant, like a trapped bird. I remembered my own frozen silence in his office. That was enough to keep me going. But the man was careful. Too careful. He never crossed the line in front of witnesses. Never left doors open more than a crack. I began to wonder if he suspected I was watching him. One evening as I was leaving, he appeared in the hallway behind me. "You've been spending a lot of time here, Sister Margaret," he said, his smile sharp. "It's good to see your commitment. But remember, sometimes too much time in the church can distract from the Lord's work in the world." I smiled back, but inside I was rattled. Was that a warning? I decided I couldn't do this alone. So I called Ruth, a longtime friend from the choir. Ruth was the kind of woman you could trust with your life. Steady, calm, and with a quiet strength that had seen her through a rough marriage. I told her everything, from my own experience to what I'd overheard with Lisa. At first she just sat there, shaking her head. "Margaret, I've heard whispers. I didn't want to believe them. Her eyes hardened. We need to be smart about this. Together we came up with a plan. Ruth would act as a decoy, request a private prayer session with him while I stayed nearby, recording. It made my stomach turn to think of putting her in that position, but Ruth was determined. If it keeps him from hurting someone else, it's worth it, she said. The night of the plan, my nerves were on fire. Ruth walked into his office, and I stayed in the hallway with my phone ready. At first, I could only hear muffled voices. Then, just like before, his tone shifted, soft, coaxing. Ruth's responses were firm at first, but then he started talking about releasing her burdens and laying hands where the Spirit guides. My grip on the phone tightened. But before I could get the recording I needed, the office door swung open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile of a pastor. It was the smile of a man who had just caught his prey. And the words he said next made my blood run cold. Because they told me he already knew exactly what I'd been doing. If you think it's easy to expose a man like Pastor Raymond, you're wrong. In the next chapter you'll see just how far he was willing to go to protect himself, and how close I came to losing everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it. Following me around, Sister Margaret. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it, a dangerous one. My breath caught in my throat. Ruth was still behind him in the office, her eyes wide, frozen in her chair. Pastor Raymond stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him just enough to block her from leaving. I forced a shaky smile. Just checking to see if you needed anything for Sunday's service. He leaned in slightly, close enough for me to smell the faint trace of cologne. You've always been so helpful. The way he said it made my skin crawl. But sometimes curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially in God's house. I could feel my palms sweating. He knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not about the recordings, but he knew I'd been watching him. And that meant I was in danger, not just of losing my place in the church, but of being discredited completely. Behind him, I heard Ruth clear her throat. Pastor, I should be going, she said firmly. He hesitated, then finally stepped aside to let her pass. She brushed past me without a word, but her hand squeezed mine, a silent message. We need to talk. As soon as we reached the parking lot, she let out a shaky breath. Margaret, he's on to us. I don't think we can pull this off inside the church anymore. He's too careful. I hated to admit it, but she was right. If we kept pushing inside his territory, we'd slip up and give him the upper hand. So I decided to change tactics. If I couldn't catch him in the act at church, maybe I could catch him elsewhere. That's when I started hearing rumors about his home visits. According to some of the women in the congregation, Pastor Raymond would show up at their houses unannounced, offering to pray over the home. Sometimes it was widows, sometimes it was younger women whose husbands worked late. And it always happened when no one else was around. I decided to test it. I asked Ruth to tell him I'd been feeling faint lately, that my blood pressure was acting up. Sure enough, 2 days later there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, there he was, Bible in one hand, a bag of oranges in the other. Just thought I'd check on you, Sister Margaret, he said with that same polished smile. I let him in, playing the role of the frail old churchwoman. You're so kind, Pastor, I said, setting the oranges on the counter. I guided him to the living room, where my phone was already hidden on the bookshelf, recording. First it was all small talk. He asked about my health, my children, the weather. Then, just as I suspected, he shifted. His voice dropped into that same honeyed tone I'd heard in the office. Let's pray, he said, moving to sit beside me on the couch. He put his hand on my back, at first near my shoulder, but then slowly sliding lower. I forced myself to stay still. My heart was pounding, my mind screaming, but I needed him to incriminate himself. I needed him to say something that couldn't be explained away as misunderstood pastoral care. And then he did. I know you've been lonely since your husband passed, he murmured. The Lord works in ways that bring comfort, sometimes through touch. The moment those words left his mouth, I knew I had him. I kept the conversation going just long enough to get more, but before it could escalate, I stood abruptly. "Pastor, I think that's enough prayer for today," I said, forcing a smile. His eyes narrowed. "Of course, Sister Margaret. I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable." He stood, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked to the door without another word. But there was a flicker in his expression, something that told me he suspected I wasn't as naive as I'd pretended. As soon as he left, I grabbed my phone and replayed the audio. It was clear. His voice, his words, the context, everything I needed to prove he was crossing a line. But as I sat there, listening to it over and over, a cold realization hit me. If I went to the church board with this, there was no guarantee they'd side with me. I'd seen what happened to women who accused powerful men, how they were painted as liars, troublemakers, or worse. I knew I needed more than audio. I needed undeniable, irrefutable proof. And that meant putting myself in even more danger. The plan I came up with next was the riskiest thing I had ever done in my life. If it failed, I wouldn't just lose my place in the church. I could lose everything. And if it worked, well, let's just say Pastor Raymond would never stand behind a pulpit again. If you think you've heard the worst of this, you haven't. In the next chapter, I'll tell you exactly how I set the trap, and how it nearly cost me my life. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with what I had to do next. I had audio, yes, but audio could be twisted, explained away, manipulated. I needed something no one could deny. Something so clear that even his most loyal supporters couldn't defend him. I decided on video. The thought made my stomach twist, because it meant putting myself in his reach again. But I knew it was the only way. I also knew I couldn't do it alone. So I called Ruth the next morning. When I told her my plan, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Margaret, you realize if this goes wrong, he could ruin you." "I know," I said. "But if it goes right, we'll stop him before he hurts someone else again." We spent the next 2 days preparing. Ruth had a small camera her grandson used for recording sports games. It was tiny, no bigger than a deck of cards, and could be hidden in plain sight. I decided to place it in my living room, angled toward the couch where I knew he'd want me to sit during prayer. We tested it 3 times, making sure it captured sound as well as video. Then, all I needed to do was get him back to my house. That part was easier than I expected. On Wednesday evening, I called him and said my blood pressure had been worse, that I felt spiritually oppressed and needed prayer. His voice was warm, concerned, maybe even eager. "Of course, Sister Margaret. I can come by tomorrow after my pastoral visits." The next day I set the stage. I left my Bible open on the coffee table, dimmed the lights just enough for a soft glow, and brewed tea so the air smelled comforting. On the surface, it looked like I was preparing for a gentle pastoral visit. In reality, I was preparing for battle. When his knock came, my hands were trembling. I let him in, playing the part of the weak and weary widow again. "Thank you for coming, Pastor," I said softly, guiding him toward the couch. We talked briefly, and then, just like before, he suggested we pray. He moved closer, one hand resting on my shoulder. I fought to keep my breathing steady, praying silently that the camera was working. It didn't take long for him to shift into the same routine, the slow lowering of his hand, the soft, suggestive tone in his voice. "Margaret," he murmured, "God wants you to be free of fear. Sometimes his healing comes in ways we don't expect." This time I didn't freeze. I leaned slightly away, giving the camera a perfect view of his hand. Kept my voice calm, neutral. "Pastor, what exactly do you mean by that?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was something in them that wasn't holy at all. "The Lord uses me to bring comfort," he said slowly. "Body and soul." There it was. The line he could never take back. I wanted to end it right there, but I knew the longer I kept him talking, the stronger my case would be. So I asked more questions, pretending to be curious, even receptive. All the while, my insides churned with disgust. Finally I stood pretending to feel faint. "I think that's enough for today," I said. He gave me a lingering look, then smiled and left without protest. The moment the door closed, I rushed to the camera, my hands shaking as I stopped the recording. I played it back immediately, my breath catching when I saw exactly what I'd hoped for. His hand, his voice, his words, all caught in crystal clarity. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a deep dread settled in my stomach. Because as I watched, I realized something I hadn't before. He was completely confident. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He acted like a man who believed he was untouchable. And if I went public with this, I'd be putting myself directly in the path of that kind of arrogance. I knew I had to be smart about my next move. That meant deciding who I could trust with this footage, and who might secretly be loyal to him. But before I could make that choice, something happened that I didn't see coming. Someone slid an envelope under my front door. When I opened it, I found a single piece of paper inside. No signature, no return address, just 6 words scrawled in black ink. "Stop digging or you'll regret it. If you think the danger ended with getting the proof, you're wrong." In the next chapter you'll see how far this was about to go, and how close I came to losing far more than my place in the church. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. I stared at the note in my hands, my skin prickling as if someone were watching me. 6 words, just 6 words, but they carried the weight of a storm. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." I looked out the window, scanning the street. Nothing but stillness. The neighbor's cat sunning itself on a porch, an old pickup truck parked under the oak tree. But I knew better than to believe I wasn't being watched. I locked every door and window, drew the curtains, and sat in my kitchen trying to calm my breathing. My first thought was that Pastor Raymond himself had sent it. But the more I considered it, the more I realized he wouldn't have done it directly. He was too careful for that. No, this had someone else's hand. Someone loyal to him. Maybe someone who already suspected I was gathering proof. That night I called Ruth. She answered on the second ring, her voice sleepy but alert when she heard the tremor in mine. I told her about the envelope. "Margaret," she said quietly, "you need to be careful. This isn't just church politics anymore. If he's sending people after you." She trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. I tried to laugh it off. I've lived through worse. But deep down I wasn't so sure. 2 days later, the proof that my instincts were right came when I came home from the grocery store to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I knew I'd locked it. Slowly I stepped inside, every creak of the floorboards echoing in my ears. At first everything looked normal until I reached the living room. The bookshelf where I'd hidden the camera had been disturbed. The books were slightly out of place. The little porcelain bird my daughter gave me tilted on its side. My stomach dropped. I rushed to my bedroom closet where I'd hidden the SD card with the footage. The box I'd tucked it in was open. The card was gone. I sank onto the bed, gripping the quilt so hard my knuckles whitened. Whoever had been here knew exactly what to look for. And that meant someone had been watching me closely enough to know I had evidence, and where I kept it. Ruth came over that evening. She found me still sitting in my room, staring at the empty box. "We can't keep this in your house," she said firmly. "From now on we store anything we get in a safe place, off-site." I nodded, but inside I was boiling. They thought they'd scared me into silence. They thought that by taking the card they could erase the truth. What they didn't know was that I'd made 2 copies. One was gone, yes, but the other was hidden in a place no one in the church would think to look. Still, the break-in had rattled me. For the first time I started to wonder if this fight was bigger than I could handle. It wasn't just about my word against his anymore. It was about survival. The next Sunday I went to church as usual. I wanted to keep up appearances, to avoid tipping my hand. Pastor Raymond preached with his usual fire, walking back and forth across the pulpit. His voice rising as he talked about false witnesses and wolves in sheep's clothing. Every so often, his eyes would meet mine, and a smile would flicker across his lips. After the service, He made his way to me in the crowd. His hand rested on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too tightly. "Good to see you here, Sister Margaret," he said warmly. "You're looking well," smiled back. "I'm fine, Pastor. Just praying for the truth to come out." His smile froze for half a second. Then it returned, wider than before. "Truth always wins in the end," he said. It was the first time I felt certain he knew exactly what I had, and that he wasn't going to wait quietly for me to use it. That night, Ruth called with news that shook me even more. One of the younger women from church, someone I barely knew, had been hospitalized after falling down a flight of stairs. Ruth didn't believe it was an accident. She thought the girl had been trying to speak up. And if that was true, then I wasn't just dealing with a predator. I was dealing with a man who would go to any length to protect himself, which meant I needed to strike before he struck again. I knew exactly how to do it. But it would mean stepping into his world one last time, and letting him think he'd already won. If you think I was ready to back down, you don't know me. The next chapter will reveal the plan I made to bring him down once and for all. But I'll warn you, it was dangerous enough that I wasn't sure I'd make it out. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Every day I hesitated was another day he could hurt someone else. Or worse, make one of his threats real. If he had the audacity to send people into my home, he wouldn't think twice about destroying my reputation or my life. The problem was, I couldn't just drop the evidence into the lap of the church board and expect justice. Too many of them were loyal to him, either because of years of friendship or because they feared losing their positions if they opposed him. If I wanted to bring him down, I had to make sure the truth was undeniable and public. That's when I decided, this confrontation needed to happen where everyone could see it. No back rooms. No closed doors. No chance for him to twist my words before the truth spread. I thought about who could help me pull that off, and one name came to mind: Deacon Howard. He was one of the oldest members of the church, respected by everyone, but lately, I'd noticed him looking uneasy during Pastor Raymond's sermons. He'd once told me quietly, "The Lord sees everything, Sister Margaret. Some men think their title will save them. It won't." So I called him. When I told him my story, everything from that first night in the office to the break-in, there was a long silence on the other end. Then he said, "I believe you. And I think I know a way." His plan was simple but risky. The church had an upcoming testimony night, where members could share personal stories of faith. It was always packed, half the town came. If I stood up there and told my truth, with the camera and audio ready to play for everyone, there would be no stopping it. But it meant I had to stand in front of a room full of people, some of whom I loved like family, and shatter their image of the man they'd been following for years. It also meant giving him the opportunity to retaliate in real time. I spent the next week preparing. Ruth kept the footage and audio safe, hidden in her cousin's house 2 towns over. Deacon Howard arranged for me to be one of the last speakers of the night, giving me the advantage of closing the event. And I prayed, harder than I ever had before, for courage. The night came and the church was buzzing. I sat in the second row, my palms sweating as person after person went up to share how Pastor Raymond had changed their lives. Each glowing testimony made my stomach churn. It wasn't that he hadn't done good things. He had. But evil doesn't always come in the form of a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it smiles at you from the pulpit every Sunday. Finally, my name was called. I stood, my legs feeling heavier than they had in years, and walked up to the microphone. I started with the safe parts: how the church had been my home, how I'd found comfort here after my husband's passing. I saw Pastor Raymond in the front row, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded loosely, his smile polite but distant. Then I said the words that made the air in the room change. "But there's something you all need to know. Something that's been happening behind closed doors." The murmur started immediately. Pastor Raymond's smile didn't fade, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. Sharp, calculating. "I trusted our pastor with my grief, with my prayers, with my safety," I continued, my voice trembling but growing stronger. And he betrayed that trust in ways no man of God ever should. I saw a few heads snap toward him. He sat perfectly still. "I'm not the only one," I said, scanning the room. "And tonight you're going to hear proof." Ruth, sitting near the back, stood and began walking toward the sound booth with a flash drive in her hand. But before she could get there, the lights in the sanctuary flickered, then went out entirely. Gasps filled the room. In the darkness, I heard hurried footsteps near the front. And then, the sound of the microphone being ripped from its stand. If you think I was going to back down just because he tried to silence me, you're wrong. In the next chapter, you'll see exactly how I fought back in the dark, and how the truth still found the light. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The sanctuary was swallowed in darkness, the hum of the ceiling fans silenced, the soft glow of the exit signs barely outlining the shapes of the crowd. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. This was exactly the kind of intimidation I'd been expecting. I clutched the microphone stand instinctively, but my hand met only empty air. Someone had ripped it away. In the shuffle of feet, I caught the faint scent of Pastor Raymond's cologne. "Sit down, Sister Margaret." His voice came low and sharp in my ear. "Before you embarrass yourself." It wasn't the warm pastoral tone he used for the congregation. It was the voice of a man who thought he still had the upper hand. I turned toward where I thought his shadow was, my voice steady despite the tremor in my knees. "This isn't my embarrassment, Pastor. This is yours." In the dark, people were shifting, murmuring. A few called out for someone to check the fuse box. Others were asking if it was a blown transformer. I knew I had seconds before the chaos died down and he tried to regain control. "Ruth!" I called out, my voice cutting through the noise. "Play it." Somewhere toward the back, I heard the click of a laptop. A second later, the sanctuary filled with sound. Not music, not scripture, but the unmistakable voice of Pastor Raymond from my living room recording. "God wants you to be free of fear. Sometimes his healing comes in ways we don't expect." The room went deathly quiet. And then his voice again, smooth and deliberate. "The Lord uses me to bring comfort, body and soul." Murmurs. The darkness seemed to amplify every reaction. That's when the lights snapped back on. He was standing not 2 feet from me, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. The smile was gone. Around us, faces turned toward him. Some in disbelief, some in anger, some already connecting dots they'd been ignoring for years. Deacon Howard was the first to move. He stepped between us, his voice firm. "Pastor, you need to step away." Raymond's gaze flicked to him, then back to me. "You've been deceived," he told the congregation. His voice loud, commanding. "The devil uses lies to divide the church." But Ruth wasn't done. The audio kept playing, my voice in the background asking him exactly what he meant. His own words digging his grave. People were no longer looking at me, they were staring at him. Some were whispering to each other. A woman in the third row had tears in her eyes. I knew right then that the grip he'd had on this church for years was starting to crack. He tried again, his voice booming. "This is taken out of context. I was offering pastoral care." That was when Lisa, quiet, timid Lisa, stood up in the back. Her voice shook, but it carried. "She's telling the truth. He did it to me too." The entire room seemed to inhale at once. I turned toward her, and in that moment, I knew we weren't alone anymore. But Pastor Raymond wasn't finished. I could see it in the way his fists clenched, the way his chest rose and fell. A man like him didn't surrender. He fought, even when cornered. And what he did next would prove just how dangerous he really was. If you think this is where he crumbled, you're wrong. The next chapter will show you exactly how far a man will go when his power is slipping away. And how close I came to losing more than my voice. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it. The moment Lisa's words hit the air, Pastor Raymond's composure cracked. Not enough for the untrained eye to catch, but I saw it. A flicker of panic in his eyes, a tightening in his jaw, a twitch in his left hand. He looked like a man who had been cornered for the first time in years. The congregation had shifted. People who had been sitting comfortably in their pews were now leaning forward, whispering, their eyes darting between him and me. I could almost hear the trust crumbling. He stepped forward, his voice rising. This is a coordinated attack. The enemy has planted seeds of lies in the hearts of those who would seek to destroy God's work. But his words didn't carry the same authority they once did. There was something different now. Something in the air that told me the people were no longer swallowing everything he said. I thought we had him. I thought that in just a few more moments, the truth would stand unshaken. But I had underestimated just how desperate a man like him could become when backed into a corner. As I stood there, gripping the pulpit for support, I saw him glance toward the side door of the sanctuary. That glance lasted less than a second, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then it happened. Two men I didn't recognize stepped into the sanctuary from that side door, dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. They moved quickly, purposefully, straight toward the front. I'd been around long enough to recognize intimidation when I saw it. Deacon Howard moved instinctively, stepping in front of me. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Pastor Raymond smiled faintly. "Just a couple of brothers from our outreach ministry, here to make sure order is maintained." But I could see it, the unspoken threat in their posture, the way they positioned themselves between me and the nearest exit. My pulse quickened. One of them leaned in close to me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You've said enough. Time to step down." Ruth stood up from the back, her voice cutting through the tension. "Don't you touch her," she shouted. A few members of the congregation stood too, murmuring in protest. The pressure in the room was building like a storm ready to break. And then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, Pastor Raymond strode back up to the pulpit and slammed his Bible down so hard the sound echoed through the sanctuary. "I rebuke this spirit of division in the name of Jesus," he bellowed. "You will not destroy this church." But the more he shouted, the more people's faces hardened. I could see it, doubt, anger, betrayal. The cracks were widening, and he knew it. One of the suited men stepped toward me again, but before he could speak, Lisa moved from the back of the room and stood beside me. Then another woman. Then another. Within seconds, I wasn't standing alone anymore. The sight of us together, voices once silenced now united, was enough to shift the power in the room. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes. But that fear didn't mean he was finished. I knew this man. I knew he'd try one last thing, something drastic, something that could destroy me completely if I wasn't ready. And what he did next? Put my life in real danger. If you think this battle was over just because the truth was in the open, you're wrong. The final chapter will show exactly how far he went, and how I made sure he'd never hold power over another soul again. Please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the ending. I could see it in his eyes. This was the moment Pastor Raymond was going to make his last move. The congregation had turned into a sea of tense faces, some leaning forward, others gripping hymnals like shields. I was surrounded now, Lisa to my right, Ruth to my left, and several other women who had stepped forward, breaking years of silence in a single act of solidarity. But Raymond wasn't the type to admit defeat. He looked around the sanctuary as if measuring his options, and then his gaze landed back on me. "This is your doing," he said slowly, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "You've allowed yourself to be used by the enemy, Sister Margaret. And I won't let you tear apart what God has built here." His words were for the crowd, but his eyes, they were locked on mine, full of something darker than holy indignation. I knew that look. I'd seen it in men who believed they owned the room, and everyone in it. And then, with a sudden motion, he stepped away from the pulpit and reached into his inside jacket pocket. My breath caught. For a split second I thought, God help me, he might be reaching for a weapon. The two men in suits tensed, ready to move. Instead he pulled out a thick envelope. He held it up like a trophy. "In here," he said loudly, are letters, messages, and testimonies from people you've hurt over the years. People who say you are the problem, Sister Margaret. Not me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He was trying to flip the script, to paint me as the wolf and himself as the wounded shepherd. But I'd been ready for this. I took a step forward, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. You mean the letters you had people write because they were afraid of losing their place in this church? The statements you coerced from women who were too scared to speak the truth? The congregation was dead silent now. I nodded to Ruth. She handed the flash drive to Deacon Howard, who moved to the sound booth. A moment later, the screen behind the pulpit lit up, not with my words but with his image. The hidden camera footage from my living room played in crystal clarity. His voice was unmistakable. God wants you to be free of fear. Sometimes his healing comes in ways we don't expect. The Lord uses me to bring comfort, body and soul. You could have heard a pin drop. His eyes went wide for a split second before he regained his composure, but it was too late. People were no longer looking at me. They were staring at him, and what they saw couldn't be denied. One of the suited men stepped forward as if to shut it off, but several deacons moved to block him. Lisa's voice rang out clear. You did the same thing to me. Another woman added. And to me. The air shifted completely. This was no longer a battle between him and me. It was the congregation itself rising up. Pastor Raymond tried one last time, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This is the devil's work." But his words fell flat. No one moved to defend him. The elders approached, and for the first time since I'd known him, he stepped back. Deacon Howard's voice was firm. Pastor Raymond, you are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You will not step foot in this church again. The suits didn't escort me out, they escorted him. As the doors closed behind him, a wave of relief washed over me. My knees felt weak, my heart heavy. This wasn't victory in the way people imagine it. It wasn't about feeling triumphant. It was about finally being safe. After the service, people came up to me, some apologizing for doubting me, others thanking me for speaking when they couldn't. Lisa hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. You saved us, she whispered. But I shook my head. We saved each other. In the weeks that followed, the church went through a painful rebuilding. Some members left, unable to face the truth. Others stayed, determined to restore the place to what it should have been all along, a refuge, not a hunting ground. And me. I learned that silence is the soil where evil grows. The life lesson I carry, and the one I want you to remember, is this. Never let fear silence you. No matter how respected or powerful someone is, wrong is still wrong. Even if your voice shakes. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it sets everyone free. If this story has touched you, if it's reminded you that quiet strength can shatter even the tallest walls, please like this video, share it with someone who needs courage, and subscribe so more people can hear stories that matter. Your voice is more powerful than you think.